The papers were already signed when Alina sat down for breakfast. She did not know this yet. She only knew that Edward was staring at his plate instead of eating from it, and that the butler, Grant, had not met her eyes when he poured her tea. Something in the house had shifted overnight, the way air shifts before a storm breaks, and she felt it on her skin before she understood what it meant. "You look pale," she said, reaching for the toast. "Did you not sleep?" "I slept fine," Edward said. He had not slept at all. He had spent the night in his study with a lawyer and a stack of documents, arranging the end of a marriage the way another man might arrange the sale of a horse. It was not cruelty, not exactly. It was simply how Edward Ashford solved problems. He looked at what no longer served him, and he removed it. Alina had stopped serving him 3 weeks earlier, when her family's shipping company lost its largest contract to a rival house. The money that had kept Ashford Hall standing for 2 generations had dried up overnight, and Edward, watching his ledgers bleed red, had done what he always did when a plan failed. He had found a better one. Her name was Margaret Vane. She was the daughter of a trade minister, connected to half the great houses in the country, and she had made her interest in Edward known at 3 separate dinners in the span of a month. She did not need his money. She had plenty of her own, and more importantly, she had the kind of political weight that could lift a struggling duke back onto solid ground. Edward set down his fork. "Alina," he said, "I need you to listen to me without speaking until I finish." She lowered the toast. Something in his voice made her hands go still. "I have decided to end our marriage," he said. "The papers are drawn. An annulment, not a divorce, so there will be no scandal attached to your name. You will be provided for. The cottage on the coast, the one your mother left you, is already prepared. You may take whatever belongings you wish from this house." The room did not spin. The candles did not flicker. Nothing dramatic happened at all, and that was the strangest part. The way the worst sentence of her life arrived in the same flat tone a man might use to report the weather. "Why?" she said. It was not really a question, she already knew. "You know why," Edward said. "The company is finished. I cannot save this house on love alone, and I never pretended to marry you for love in the first place. Neither did you pretend otherwise. We both understood the arrangement when we entered it." This was true, and it was the cruelest kind of true, because it left her nothing to argue with. 5 years earlier, their families had sat across a table much like this one, and negotiated their marriage the way they might negotiate a border dispute. Land for money, title for stability. Alina had walked into it with open eyes, telling herself that affection could grow where duty had been planted, and it had grown slowly in small places Edward never noticed. In the way she remembered which tenant families had new bobbies, in the way she kept his mother's roses alive after his mother passed, in the way she sat up with him during the fever that nearly killed him 2 winters ago, holding a cold cloth to his forehead until dawn. None of that appeared to weigh anything against a shipping contract. "I see," she said. "I expected anger," Edward said, and there was something almost like disappointment in his voice, as though her calm was inconveniencing him. Tears, perhaps, accusations. "Would they change your decision?" "No." "Then I will save us both the trouble." She stood. Her chair made a small sound against the floor, the only sharp noise in a conversation that had otherwise ended a marriage as quietly as closing a book. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden her mother had helped her plant when she first came to this house as a bride, the roses climbing the low stone wall, the herb beds she had grown from cutting smuggled in her travel case. She had spent 5 years turning that patch of dirt into something alive, the same way she had spent 5 years trying to turn this marriage into something more than a contract. "I would like to keep my mother's garden shears," she said, "and the seeds I have saved, nothing else of value. You may have the rest returned to the estate." Edward blinked. Of all the things he had prepared himself to hear, this was not one of them. "That is all you want." "That is all I need." He watched her face for something. some crack he could point to later and say, "There, I saw the truth of her feelings, but her expression gave him nothing." She had learned, in 5 years of being useful rather than loved, how to keep her face as still as a locked door. "The annulment will be finalized within the month," he said, because he did not know what else to say. "Lady Vane will move into the East Wing once the arrangements are settled. I trust you will be gone before then." "You will not have to trust it," Elinor said. "I will be gone by the end of the week." She left the breakfast room without touching her toast, without raising her voice, without giving him a single moment he could later use to feel justified in his cruelty. She simply left, and the sound of her footsteps on the stone floor was the only thing that told Edward the conversation had actually happened at all. He sat alone at the long table for a long while after that, staring at the chair across from him. He told himself he felt relief. He told himself this was the sensible outcome, the practical outcome, the only outcome that made sense for a man in his position. A duke could not run an estate on sentiment. A duke needed alliances, contracts, connections that carried weight in rooms where decisions about land and law were actually made. Margaret Vane offered all of that. Elinor Hartley, whatever her quiet virtues, offered only herself. He believed this completely, the way a man believes a lie he has told himself so many times it has started to feel like memory. 3 days later, Elinor packed 2 trunks. Grant, the butler, carried them down to the waiting carriage himself, though it was not his job to do so, and when he set the second trunk down he lingered a moment longer than necessary. "The house will not be the same, my lady," he said quietly. "The house will be exactly what he wants it to be," Elinor said. "That is enough for him." "It was never enough for the rest of us." She looked at him then, this man who had served the Ashford family for 30 years and had never once, in 5 years of her marriage, said a word out of place. His loyalty had always seemed to belong entirely to the house itself, to the stone and the history and the name carved above the door. She had not realized until that moment that some small part of it had belonged to her. "Thank you, Grant," she said, and meant it more than she had meant anything in weeks. The cook, Mrs. Doyle, came out to say goodbye as well, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, her eyes red though she tried to hide it. The stable boy, a lanky 15-year-old named Sam who had spent the better part of 2 years learning to garden under Elinor's patient instruction, stood at the edge of the drive with his cap in his hands and said nothing at all, because there was nothing a boy his age could find to say to a woman being sent away from the only home he had ever seen her live in. Edward watched the carriage pull away from an upstairs window. He had told himself he would not watch, and then he had found himself standing at the glass anyway, arms crossed, jaw tight, as the black carriage rolled down the long gravel drive and out through the iron gates that marked the edge of Ashford land. He did not wave, she did not look back. When the carriage disappeared around the bend in the road, Edward turned from the window and went to find his steward, because there was still the matter of preparing the house for its new duchess, and a man in his position did not have time to stand at windows watching things that were already finished. The garden, however, would not stop being a problem. Within 2 weeks, without anyone touching it wrong, the roses along the stone wall began to droop. The herb beds, so carefully tended for 5 years, turned brittle and pale, as though the soil itself had noticed who was missing and decided it no longer wished to grow anything at all. Edward walked past it every morning on his way to the stables and told himself it meant nothing. Gardens died sometimes. It was simply the season turning. It was, in fact, the height of summer. Sam noticed it first, kneeling in the dirt with a watering can in his hand, frowning at leaves that should have been green and were instead curling at the edges like paper held too close to a flame. He watered them twice a day. He checked the soil for insects, for rot, for anything he could name and fix. He found nothing wrong that a boy his age could point to and explain, and that frightened him more than any answer would have, because it meant the garden was simply choosing to stop. He did not tell the Duke about it. He was not sure the Duke would care to hear that a patch of dirt seemed to be grieving on behalf of the household. Edward, for his part, filled the empty hours of that first week with the business of preparation. Letters went out to Margaret Vane's family confirming dates. Rooms in the East Wing were cleared of Aline's old belongings and repainted in colors better suited, Edward decided, to a woman of Margaret's taste. He walked through the halls of Ashford Hall making lists in his head, the way he always did when he wanted to feel in control of something, and for a while the lists worked well enough to keep the quieter thoughts away. But the house itself seemed reluctant to cooperate with his plans. A portrait of his mother, which had hung crooked for exactly the length of time Aline had lived there, and always been straightened again within the hour by someone who noticed such things, now hung crooked for 3 full days before anyone thought to fix it. The kitchen ran short of the particular blend of tea Aline had always kept stocked for guests, because no one else in the household had ever thought to notice it needed restocking. Small things, forgettable things, and yet Edward found himself noticing every single one, cataloging the gaps the way a man catalogs missing teeth with his tongue, unable to stop checking even though the checking brought him no comfort. He told himself none of it mattered. A house ran on staff and routine, not on the presence of any one particular person, and routines could always be rebuilt. He was a duke. He had rebuilt larger things than a household schedule. Still, on the 5th night, alone in a dining room built for 12 and currently holding only himself, he found his eyes drifting again and again to the chair across the table, and he could not, for the life of him, remember exactly when he had started doing that, or why the habit felt so difficult to break. He blamed the wine. He blamed the late hour. He told Grant to clear the table earlier than usual and went to bed before he could examine the feeling any further, because examining it felt dangerously close to admitting something he was not yet prepared to admit. Outside, past the dark windows, the roses continued to fail, one by one, along the low stone wall. Margaret Vane arrived at Ashford Hall on a bright morning, 4 carriages deep, with more trunks than the household staff had ever unpacked for a single guest, let alone a bride. She stepped down from the lead carriage in a green traveling dress that matched her eyes, and the first thing she did, before greeting Edward, before greeting the staff lined up along the drive to receive her, was look up at the house itself, studying its stone face the way a buyer studies a property she intends to renovate. "It wants light," she said. "Too many dark curtains. We will change that." Edward laughed, charmed despite himself. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of decisiveness the house had been missing. Aline had never rearranged so much as a chair without asking 3 separate members of staff whether it might be an inconvenience. Margaret simply looked at a room and told it what to become. Within a month, the dark curtains were gone, replaced with pale gold fabric that let the morning sun spill across floors that had not seen direct light in years. The old portraits in the East Hall were moved to make room for a set of modern paintings Margaret had commissioned from an artist in the city, bold splashes of color that visitors either loved or found faintly alarming, depending on their taste. She reorganized the library by subject rather than by the alphabetical order Aline had always kept. And though it took the household weeks to relearn where anything was shelved, Margaret declared the new system vastly superior and refused to discuss reverting it. The greenhouse, the one Aline had filled with herbs and cuttings and small useless plants that produced nothing but pleasant smells, was cleared out entirely and turned into a card room, with green felt tables and crystal decanters arranged along a sideboard that had once held seed trays. "You don't mind, do you?" Margaret asked, though she had already given the order before asking. "Not at all," Edward said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it. The greenhouse had always struck him as a slightly indulgent use of space. A card room, at least, would earn its keep, hosting the kind of gatherings that built the political alliances he actually needed. Margaret was, in nearly every practical sense, exactly what Edward had hoped for. At dinner parties, she moved through conversation like a woman born for it, flattering ambassadors, charming rival lords into forgetting old grudges, steering discussions toward outcomes that consistently benefited Ashford interests. She understood trade routes and tariffs the way other women understood embroidery. She could quote shipping law from memory and had, on more than one occasion, spotted a weakness in a contract that Edward's own lawyers had missed. Within 3 months of her arrival, 2 new trade agreements had been signed, both considerably more favorable to Ashford Hall than anything Edward had managed to negotiate on his own in the previous year. He told himself, watching her hold a room full of powerful men in the palm of her hand, that he had made exactly the right choice. A duke needed a partner who understood power, not a woman who spent her afternoons pressing flowers between the pages of old books. And yet, there were things Margaret did not seem to notice, small failures that would have been unthinkable under the old order of the house. She did not know the names of the tenant families who had farmed Ashford land for 3 generations, families whose birthdays and harvests and small tragedies Alina had once tracked as carefully as a ledger of her own. When old Mrs. Kettering's cottage roof collapsed in a spring storm, it was Grant who quietly arranged for repairs because Margaret had not thought to ask, and Edward, absorbed in trade negotiations, had not thought of it either. The servants, too, seemed to hold themselves differently around her, not disrespectfully, nothing so obvious as that, but there was a stiffness in the way the maids curtsied, a careful distance in the way Grant delivered messages, a wariness that had never existed under Alina's quieter presence. The old dog, a graying spaniel that had once trotted eagerly to greet anyone who entered the front hall, now retreated beneath the stairs whenever Margaret's voice carried through the house, and no amount of coaxing from the kitchen staff could convince him to come out until she had passed. Edward noticed these things the way a man notices weather through a closed window, distantly, without any real sense that it concerned him. The garden, however, was harder to dismiss. By late autumn, what had once been Alina's careful arrangement of roses and herb beds had become a tangle of dead stalks and cracked soil, despite Sam's continued efforts to save it. He had tried everything he knew. New soil, brought in fresh from the eastern fields, careful watering on a strict schedule. He had even, in a fit of desperation one evening, sat beside the herb bed and talked to it quietly, as though the plants might respond to the sound of a familiar voice the way they once had under Alina's hands. Nothing worked. Margaret, passing the ruined garden on her way to the stables one afternoon, wrinkled her nose at it. "That should be cleared," she said to Edward. "It's an eyesore. We'll put in a proper lawn, something clean." "It was Alina's," Edward said, before he had quite decided to say it. Margaret glanced at him, something unreadable crossing her face for just a moment before her usual composure settled back into place. "Was it?" she said, in a tone that closed the subject rather than opened it further. "Well, all the more reason to clear it, I should think." Edward gave the order the following week. Sam dug up what remained of the dead roses with hands that shook slightly, though he told himself it was only the cold. He kept, without telling anyone, a single packet of seeds Alina had left behind in a drawer of the potting shed, tucking it into his coat pocket where no one would think to look for it. The lawn that replaced the garden was, by any reasonable measure, an improvement. Clean, green, orderly. Edward walked past it each morning and told himself he approved of the change, that a duke's estate should present itself with dignity rather than sentiment. And for a while the telling was almost enough to make it true. In early winter, a matter arose that put the difference between the 2 women into sharper focus than Edward would have liked. A tenant family on the northern edge of the estate, the Callums, lost their barn to a fire started by a lightning strike, and with it most of the grain they had stored for the coming months. It was the kind of small crisis that happened every few years on an estate the size of Ashford Hall, the sort of thing a good landlord handled quietly, before word of it spread and made the household look careless. Grant brought the matter to Edward directly, as he always had, laying out the facts with the calm efficiency of a man who had managed such problems for 30 years. Edward listened, nodded, and told him to arrange for a wagon of grain to be sent north within the week. It was the correct response, the practical response, and he considered the matter closed the moment he gave the order. It was Sam, of all people, who mentioned afterward that the Callums had a daughter recovering from a fever, and that a leaner, in years past, would have sent more than grain. She would have sent blankets and a note in her own hand, and arranged for the family's youngest boy to spend a few weeks working in the stables so there would be one less mouth for them to feed while they rebuilt. She had known, without being told, that a crisis like this one was never only about grain. Edward had not thought to ask about a daughter, or a fever, or anything beyond the barn itself. He mentioned it to Margaret that evening, half expecting her to suggest something similar, some small additional kindness that might smooth over the family's hardship and not incidentally reflect well on the house. "A wagon of grain is generous," Margaret said, looking up from a letter she was writing to a trade contact in the capital. "I shouldn't think we need to do more than that. If we start sending blankets to every family with a sick child, we'll have half the county at our door by spring." It was not an unreasonable thing to say, exactly. It was practical, even sensible, the kind of boundary a busy household might need to set. And yet it sat wrong in Edward's chest in a way he could not quite name, a small stone lodged somewhere he could not reach to remove it. He said nothing further on the matter, and the grain was sent, and the Callum family thanked him formally through a letter delivered by their eldest son, and the whole affair was, by any official measure, resolved. But word travels through a household the way water travels through soil, quietly, along paths no one plans or notices, until the ground itself has changed shape. Within 2 weeks, the story of the Callum fire had spread among the tenant families in a slightly altered form, the kind of story that grows a little truer to its feeling with each retelling even as its facts blur. The old Duchess would have visited herself, people said. The old Duchess would have known about the daughter's fever before anyone told her. The new one sent grain and a letter and nothing more, and perhaps that was proper, perhaps that was even generous by the standards of most great houses, but it was not the same, and everyone on Ashford land seemed to feel the difference in a way none of them could fully explain to Edward even if he had thought to ask. He did not think to ask. He was, by that point, deep in preparations for the winter season's first grand dinner, an event Margaret had been planning for weeks with the same precision she brought to trade negotiations, determined that it would announce her arrival to society as Ashford Hall's new Duchess in a manner no one could question or forget. The guest list included Lord Whitmore, an old friend of Edward's father and a man whose good opinion carried weight in 3 counties. Lord Whitmore had lost his eldest son at sea 2 years prior, a fact every member of the household staff knew by instinct, the kind of knowledge that simply accumulated in a house over years of careful attention to the people who passed through it. Eleanor had always known, without needing to be told, which topics to steer conversations away from at Lord Whitmore's table, which jokes to avoid, which silences to fill with something gentler. Margaret did not know this. No one had thought to tell her, and she had never thought to ask. Halfway through the second course, in the middle of a light-hearted story about a shipping mishap, Margaret made an offhand joke about sailors lost at sea, delivered with the easy confidence of a woman used to holding a room's attention. The table went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone present understands a mistake has been made except the person who made it. Lord Whitmore's face did not change, not obviously, but something behind his eyes closed like a door being quietly shut. He set down his fork with great care and said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if he had said everything. Edward felt the silence settle over the table like a weight dropped from a height, and in the space of that silence, before he could think better of it, his eyes went instinctively to the chair beside him, the one that had sat empty at every dinner since Alina left, as though some part of him still expected her to be there, ready with the quiet word or gentle question that would ease the room back into comfort. The chair was empty. It remained empty. Edward cleared his throat and changed the subject himself, clumsily, and the dinner limped forward toward its conclusion under a politeness so strained it was nearly its own kind of insult. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and Margaret had retired to bed without any apparent awareness that anything had gone wrong, Edward sat alone in his study with a glass of wine he did not drink. He told himself he was reviewing the evening's political outcomes, weighing whether Lord Whitmore's good opinion had been permanently damaged, calculating what it might cost him in future negotiations. He was not thinking about Alina. He told himself this firmly, twice, the way a man repeats a fact he no longer quite believes. He thought about her anyway, not with longing, he insisted to himself, simply with the practical recognition that she would have prevented the evening's disaster entirely, the same way he might note that a particular tool would have made a difficult task easier. It was not sentiment. It was efficiency. A well-run house needed someone who understood its people, and Margaret, for all her considerable gifts, had never once tried to learn them. He finished the wine after all and went to bed with the uncomfortable, unfamiliar sense that he had traded something more valuable than he had realized for something that merely looked more impressive from a distance. Outside his window, the clean green lawn stretched pale and empty under the winter moon, and somewhere beneath its careful, orderly surface, the last of Alina's roses had long since finished dying. He did not sleep well that night, or the several nights that followed. Each time he closed his eyes he found himself replaying the silence at the dinner table, Lord Whitmore's fork set down so carefully, the particular stillness of a room full of people, all understanding at once that something irreplaceable had gone missing from the house, even if none of them could have said exactly what it was. Edward told himself it was only fatigue, only the strain of managing a household through a difficult season, and he threw himself further into work, into contracts and ledgers and the comfortable certainty of numbers, because numbers, unlike people, never left a room feeling smaller than it had before. The letter arrived on a gray morning in early spring, addressed to Edward in a hand he did not recognize, and it took him 3 lines to understand that it concerned Alina at all. It was from a shipping associate in the coastal town of Hallowmere, a man Edward had done minor business with years before, writing now on a matter he described as unrelated to trade, but which he thought the Duke might wish to know regardless. The associate had, by chance, met a woman running a small apothecary near the harbor, a Mrs. Hartley, who had apparently restored the shop from near ruin within a matter of months and turned it into one of the more respected businesses in the town. The associate mentioned this only because he had recognized her name from years past and thought it a curious enough coincidence to pass along. Edward read the letter twice, then a third time, sitting alone in his study with the fire burned down to embers beside him. He told himself the interest he felt was purely practical. A successful business, even a small one, reflected in some indirect way on the Ashford name. Since Alina still carried it informally in the minds of people who remembered her marriage, whatever the annulment papers technically said, it would do no harm to confirm the details himself. This was, he knew even as he thought it, a poor excuse for the sudden, restless energy that carried him to the stables that same afternoon, and had him mounted and riding south before he had fully decided to go. Hallowmere sat 2 hours from Ashford Hall by horse, a modest fishing town built along a curved harbor, its streets lined with weathered shops that smelled of salt and tar. And as Edward discovered when he finally located the apothecary, something sweeter underneath, herbs drying in bundles from the rafters, the same faint green scent that had once filled the greenhouse Margaret had converted into a card room. He stood outside the shop for a long moment before entering, watching through the window as Alina moved between shelves, arranging small glass bottles with the same careful attention she had once given to arranging seed trays. She wore a plain dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dirt still faintly visible under her fingernails from some earlier task in a garden he could not yet see. She looked, Edward thought, entirely unlike the quiet, careful Duchess who had sat across from him at 10,000 silent dinners. She looked, instead, like a woman who had built something with her own two hands and knew exactly what it was worth. A bell above the door announced him when he finally stepped inside, and Alina turned, expecting a customer, her professional smile already forming before her eyes fully registered who stood in the doorway. The smile did not disappear exactly. It simply changed, settling into something more careful, more distant, the kind of expression a person wears when greeting someone they no longer feel obligated to please. "Edward," she said, "this is unexpected." "I was in the area," he said, which was a lie so obvious that neither of them bothered pretending otherwise. Hallowmere was not on the way to anywhere Ashford business required him to be. "I see." She set down the bottle in her hand and wiped her palms on her apron. "Well, you found me. Was there something you needed?" The question was polite and entirely without warmth, and Edward found himself unprepared for how much that absence stung. He had expected, without quite admitting it to himself, some flicker of the old softness, some sign that 5 years of marriage had left a mark on her the way it had, apparently, left one on him. Instead, he found a woman who regarded him with the mild, patient interest she might have shown any customer who wandered in without a clear purpose. "I heard about your shop," he said. "From a business associate. I wanted to see it for myself." "That's kind of you." She did not sound as though she believed it was kindness at all, and she was not entirely wrong. "As you can see, it's doing well. Better than I expected, honestly. People here needed a proper apothecary, and I had the knowledge from years of managing the still room at the hall. It turns out that knowledge is worth quite a lot to people who don't have easy access to a doctor." "You seem happy," Edward said, and heard, too late, how much the words revealed. "I am," Alina said simply. "It surprised me too, at first. I thought I would grieve the house for longer than I did. But there is something about building a thing entirely with your own hands, something that belongs only to you, that I never had at Ashford Hall. Everything there belonged to the estate. Even me, in a way, though I didn't understand that until I left." Edward had no answer for this. He looked around the shop instead, at the neat rows of labeled bottles, the drying herbs, the small wooden counter Alina had clearly built or commissioned herself. Everything arranged with the same quiet competence she had once brought to running his household, except now it served no one's interests but her own. "The garden," he said, because he did not know how else to fill the silence, "the one at the hall, it didn't survive the winter." Something flickered across Alina's face, there and gone before he could say for certain what it was. Grief, perhaps, or perhaps something closer to vindication, though he did not think that was entirely fair to her. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and her tone suggested she was not entirely sorry at all. "Does it not bother you?" Edward asked before he could stop himself. "Working with your hands like this, mixing tinctures, it's a far cry from managing a household of 40 staff." Alina considered the question seriously, as though it deserved more than a polite dismissal. "I used to think running a great house was the only kind of work suited to a woman of my birth," she said. "It took me leaving it to understand that work is simply work. There is no more dignity in overseeing 40 servants than there is in mixing a tincture that eases a child's fever. Less, perhaps, since the tincture actually helps someone, and I know it helped them because they come back and tell me so themselves. At the hall, I never truly knew whether anything I did mattered to anyone beyond keeping the household running smoothly enough that you never had to think about it." The observation landed with more force than she likely intended, or perhaps exactly the force she intended. Edward could not be certain which. He thought of the tea that had gone unrestocked, the crooked portrait no one thought to straighten, the birthdays and harvests and small tragedies that had simply stopped being tracked the moment she left, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly how much invisible labor had kept his household functioning without his ever once noticing its source. "I never thanked you for any of that," he said quietly. "The running of things, I took it as simply how a house was meant to operate." "You didn't need to thank me," Alina said, though not unkindly. "It was the arrangement we agreed to. I've made my peace with what our marriage was, Edward. I would ask that you not come here trying to make peace with it yourself at my expense. I have built something new. I would like to be allowed to keep it uncomplicated." A woman entered the shop then, a neighbor by the easy familiarity of her greeting, and Alina's face brightened in a way it had not brightened once during her entire conversation with Edward. "Grace," Alina said warmly, "you're early. I haven't finished the tincture yet, but it should be ready within the hour." "No trouble at all," the woman said, glancing curiously at Edward before returning her attention to Alina. "I can wait. Henry's been asking after you again, by the way. Wants to know if you're coming to the harbor dinner on Sunday." "Tell him I wouldn't miss it," Alina said, laughing, an easy, unguarded sound Edward could not remember ever hearing from her during their marriage, not even in their better moments. Edward stood at the edge of this small, warm exchange, feeling like an intruder in a life that had continued on perfectly well without him, had in fact grown fuller and brighter in his absence, as though he had been not a husband but an obstacle, cleared away to make room for something better. "I should let you get back to your work," he said, when Grace had wandered to browse the shelves. "Of course." Alina walked him the few steps to the door, polite to the last, the way she might see out any customer who had taken up more of her time than she had to spare. "It was good to see you looking well, Edward. Give my regards to your household." She did not say Margaret's name. She did not ask about the marriage, or the estate, or anything that might have suggested she still held any curiosity at all about the life she had left behind. She simply held the door for him with the same steady composure she had shown him 5 years ago, and 5 years before that, and he realized, standing on the street outside her shop with the salt air stinging his eyes, that this composure had never once been for his benefit. It had simply been who she was, patient and contained and entirely unwilling to give away more of herself than a situation required. He had mistaken that patience once for a kind of weakness. Watching her now through the window as she returned to her work, laughing again at something Grace said, he understood it had never been weakness at all. It had been restraint, carefully practiced restraint, the kind that comes from a person who has learned exactly how much of herself is safe to offer and how much must be kept in reserve. The ride back to Ashford Hall passed in a blur Edward could not later recall with any clarity. He remembered dismounting at the stables, handing his horse to a groom without a word, and walking the long gravel drive toward the house on foot. Though he could not have said why he chose to walk when riding would have been faster. He remembered passing the flat green lawn where Alina's garden had once grown, and stopping there for a long moment, staring at grass that gave back nothing, no memory, no evidence that anything had ever bloomed on that ground at all. Sam found him there some time later, standing motionless in the fading light, and hesitated at the edge of the drive, unsure whether to approach. "Your Grace," the boy said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel improper to leave unbroken. Edward turned. "Sam." "I still have some of her seeds," the boy said quietly, as though confessing something. "The old duchesses. I couldn't bring myself to throw them out when we cleared the beds. I kept meaning to ask if I might plant a small patch somewhere, out past the stables where no one would mind. Somewhere that wouldn't need to look proper for guests." Edward looked at the boy for a long moment, this 15-year-old who had somehow understood, without ever being told, exactly what Edward himself had only just begun to grasp. That some things were worth keeping not because they served any practical purpose, but simply because They had once mattered to someone, and mattering was its own kind of value that a ledger could never properly account for. "Plant them," Edward said, "wherever you like. You don't need my permission for a patch of dirt behind the stables." "Yes, Your Grace." Sam hesitated, then added, with the particular boldness of a boy who has decided a question is worth the risk of asking it, "Are you well, Your Grace? You look tired." "I'm fine," Edward said, the same automatic lie he had told Eleanor months ago at a breakfast table that felt now like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. He was not fine. He understood this clearly for the first time as he continued up the drive toward the house, toward the pale gold curtains and the modern paintings and the wife who understood trade agreements better than any woman in the country and had never once, in nearly a year of marriage, asked him a single question about how he was actually feeling, because it had simply never occurred to either of them that such a question belonged in their arrangement. He had built a marriage on everything a duke was supposed to want, and standing on his own front steps, keys jingling faintly in his pocket, he found he could not remember the last time he had wanted any of it at all. Inside, Margaret was hosting a small gathering of trade officials in the drawing room, her voice carrying warm and confident through the closed door, negotiating some new agreement that would, no doubt, prove excellent for Ashford Hall's finances. Edward stood in the entrance hall for a long moment, listening to her laugh at something one of the officials said, and found he had no desire whatsoever to join them. He went instead to his study, poured a glass of wine he did not drink, and sat alone in the dark, thinking of a small shop that smelled of drying herbs, and a laugh he had never once managed to earn in 5 years of marriage, and a woman who had built, entirely on her own, a life that no longer had any room in it for him at all. Margaret found him there an hour later, once her guests had gone, standing in the doorway of his study with the particular sharpness in her eyes that Edward had come to recognize whenever she suspected a piece of information had been withheld from her. "You missed the entire evening," she said. "Lord Ashby specifically asked after you. It reflects poorly, Edward, when a duke cannot be bothered to appear for his own guests." "I had business to attend to," Edward said. "What business?" He hesitated, and the hesitation itself told her more than any answer could have. Margaret's expression cooled by careful degrees, though her voice remained perfectly level, the voice of a woman who had learned long ago that anger displayed too openly cost more than it gained. "You went to see her," she said. "It was not a question." "I had a letter about a business matter. I confirmed the details myself, that is all." "That is not all," Margaret said, "and we both know it." She studied him a moment longer, then seemed to decide the conversation was not worth pursuing further that night, at least not directly. "I don't particularly care where you spend your afternoons, Edward, provided it does not interfere with the arrangements we have made, but I would ask you to remember which of us actually chose to stay." She left before he could answer, and the phrase followed him up to bed that night and sat with him long after the candle had burned out, turning over and over in his mind in a way he could not quite make sense of. Which of us actually chose to stay? He wondered in the dark whether Margaret had chosen to stay at all, or whether she had simply not yet found a better arrangement to leave for. It was an uncharitable thought, and he knew it, but once it had formed he found he could not set it aside. He thought of the speed with which Margaret had accepted his proposal a year earlier, how little courtship had preceded it, how the entire arrangement had been settled within weeks in a manner not unlike the negotiation of a trade contract. He had thought nothing of the speed at the time. He had been grateful for it, in fact, relieved to have the matter resolved without the slow uncertainty that so often accompanied matters of the heart. Now, lying awake with Margaret's parting words circling in his mind, he wondered whether such speed ever came from anything resembling affection, or whether it simply meant two people had each recognized, at once and without sentiment, exactly what the other could offer them. He did not sleep that night. Somewhere past midnight he rose, pulled on a coat, and walked out past the stables to where Sam had planted the small patch of seeds behind the old feed shed, invisible from the house, tucked into a corner no guest would ever think to walk. Nothing had sprouted yet. It was too early in the season for that. But Edward knelt beside the bare patch of turned earth anyway, in the cold and the dark, and stayed there a long while, though he could not have explained to anyone, least of all himself, exactly what he was searching for in a patch of dirt that had not yet decided whether it would grow anything at all. The letter from Duke Harrington arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Margaret and marked private, and Edward would not have thought anything of it at all if Grant had not mentioned, with the careful neutrality of a servant reporting something he suspected mattered, that it was the third such letter to arrive in as many weeks. Edward did not open his wife's correspondence. Whatever else could be said about the practical foundations of their marriage, he had never once questioned her right to privacy, and he told himself now that 3 letters from a duke with considerably more land and considerably more influence than Ashford Hall could hold was likely nothing more than ordinary political correspondence. Margaret managed a great deal of Ashford's trade relationships herself. A letter from Harrington Fell's estate would not, on its own, have been remarkable. It was the way Margaret's expression changed when Grant delivered it to her at breakfast that made Edward reconsider. She read the first lines, and something behind her composed face shifted, briefly, the way still water shifts when a stone breaks its surface, and then settles again into calm. She folded the letter, tucked it into her sleeve rather than leaving it on the table as she did with ordinary correspondence, and returned to her tea as though nothing at all had happened. "Business?" Edward asked. "Nothing that concerns you," Margaret said, which was, Edward reflected later, the precise moment he stopped believing anything she told him without independent confirmation. He did not confront her. That was not how their marriage operated, and he was not entirely certain he wanted to know the answer badly enough to risk the confrontation. Instead, he watched, over the following weeks, with the same careful attention he had once given to trade ledgers, cataloging small discrepancies the way he had once cataloged the absences left behind by Eleanor's departure. Margaret began traveling to the capital more frequently than her usual business required, always with a reasonable explanation attached, always returning within a few days looking, if Edward was honest with himself, brighter than she looked at Ashford Hall. She grew careless, in small ways, the way people grow careless when they believe no one is paying close enough attention to notice. A note left unburned in the study fireplace, only partially caught by the flame, bearing a signature that was not Edward's and was not, as far as Edward's memory served, the signature of any trade official he recognized. He did not need to see the entire letter to understand its shape. He had, after all, written letters very much like it himself once to a countess whose family connections had seemed, at the time, worth considerably more than the marriage he already held. The understanding that settled over him was strange in its lack of anger. He had expected, if he ever discovered such a thing, to feel something sharp and immediate, the kind of fury a man was supposed to feel upon learning his wife's attentions had wandered elsewhere. Instead, he felt something closer to recognition, the particular hollow feeling of watching a pattern repeat itself and understanding, too late, that he had been the one to first establish the pattern. He said nothing for nearly a month, partly out of some lingering hope that he was wrong, and partly because he found he did not know what he actually wanted the outcome to be. A public confrontation would embarrass them both and damage the very alliances Margaret had worked so hard to build. A quiet acceptance would mean continuing a marriage that had already, in every way that mattered, ended without either of them saying so aloud. In the weeks before that final conversation, Edward found himself, more than once, walking out past the stables in the early evening to the small patch of turned earth behind the feed shed where Sam had planted Eleanor's seeds. Green shoots had begun pushing up through the soil by early summer, thin and pale at first, then sturdier, unfurling into the same modest herbs and hardy roses that had once lined the low stone wall of the main garden. Sam tended them with quiet devotion, watering them each morning before his other chores, and Edward had taken to visiting the patch most evenings without ever quite admitting to himself why. He found, standing there among the new growth, that he could think more clearly than anywhere else on the estate. The main house had become, over the past year, a kind of stage on which he performed the role of a satisfied duke with a capable, admired wife, and the performance had grown exhausting in ways he had not expected when he first agreed to it. Here, behind the feed shed, in a garden no guest would ever see, he did not need to perform anything at all. It was on one such evening, kneeling beside the young roses with dirt on his own hands for the first time in longer than he could remember, that Edward allowed himself to fully examine the note he had found half-burned in the study fireplace weeks earlier. He had kept it, folded small, tucked into an inner pocket where Margaret would not think to look, though he had not yet decided what he intended to do with it. The handwriting was elegant, clearly a man of education and standing, and though the fire had claimed the opening lines, what remained spoke plainly enough of a future the writer hoped Margaret might share with him, once certain obligations at Ashford Hall had been properly concluded. Certain obligations. Edward turned the phrase over in his mind, sitting there in the dirt with Sam's careful rows of green shoots rising up around him, and understood that he had become, in the span of a single year, precisely the kind of obligation a more advantageous marriage was designed to conclude. He did not feel the anger he had expected to feel, reading those words. He felt, instead, a strange and unwelcome kinship with the letter's author, two men who had each looked at a marriage and calculated, with cold clarity, exactly what could still be gained by ending it in favor of something else. He burned what remained of the note properly, this time, watching the paper curl and blacken in the evening air, and walked back to the house with the quiet, settled certainty that whatever conversation lay ahead of him with Margaret, he would not be the one to prevent it from happening. Margaret made the decision for him, in the end, with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else. She came to his study on a wet evening in early summer, a season that felt, to Edward, uncomfortably close to the anniversary of the morning he had ended his first marriage over cold toast and a folded napkin. She did not sit. She stood in the doorway with a composure so complete it bordered on performance, and Edward understood, before she said a single word, exactly what was about to happen. "I've had an offer from Duke Fell," she said. "Marriage, once matters here are formally concluded. His estate holds 3 times the land Ashford does, and connections that reach considerably further into the capital than anything available to us here. I intend to accept." Edward set down the papers he had been reviewing, though he did not immediately look up. "I see." "I expected more argument," Margaret said, and there was something almost like disappointment in her voice, an echo so precise of his own words to Alina a year earlier that Edward nearly laughed, though nothing about the moment struck him as remotely funny. "Would it change your decision?" "No." "Then I'll save us both the trouble of pretending otherwise." Something crossed Margaret's face then, a flicker of surprise, perhaps, that he had not fought harder to keep her, or perhaps simple relief that he understood the shape of the situation as clearly as she did. Whatever it was, she recovered without a trace of it, settling back into the composed efficiency that had first drawn Edward to her a year ago, the same competence he had once admired in the drawing-room and now, standing on the other side of a marriage's quiet unraveling, found he could recognize for exactly what it had always been. Not warmth, not partnership, not in the way he had once told himself it was. Simply two people who had each looked at the other and calculated, correctly, what could be gained. "The arrangements will take some weeks to finalize," Margaret said. "I'll remain until then, for the sake of appearances, and depart quietly once the papers are settled. I trust that suits you." "It suits me fine," Edward said. She left the study without another word, and Edward sat alone at his desk for a long while afterward, staring at a chair that had never once, in a full year of marriage, been pulled close enough to his own for any conversation that did not involve trade routes or tariffs or the careful management of Ashford's political standing. He thought of Eleanor's calm at that same kind of moment, a year earlier, the way she had asked only for garden shears and left without a single tear he had been forced to witness. He had mistaken that calm at the time for indifference, for proof that their marriage had never mattered to her the way it should have. Sitting now in the wreckage of a second marriage that had promised so much more and delivered so little that actually lasted, he understood the calm differently. It had not been indifference at all. It had been dignity, the particular dignity of a woman who refused to let her worth be measured by whether a man chose to keep her. He did not have that dignity available to him now. He had, if he was honest with himself, very little dignity left at all, having spent the last year proving himself precisely as replaceable as he had once decided Eleanor was. Margaret departed 6 weeks later, on a bright morning that felt, to Edward, obscenely cheerful for the occasion. She left with considerably less ceremony than she had arrived, 4 carriages reduced to 2, the modern paintings she had commissioned already crated and shipped ahead of her to whatever grand estate awaited her at Duke Fell's household. She did not ask to keep anything of sentimental value on her way out, because nothing at Ashford Hall, Edward understood now, had ever held any sentimental value for her at all. It had simply been a useful arrangement, occupied efficiently and abandoned just as efficiently the moment a better arrangement presented itself. She paused at the carriage door, the way Eleanor had not paused, and looked back at Edward standing on the front steps of the house he had once been so certain she would help him build into something greater. "You'll find someone else," she said, not unkindly. "Men like you always do." "Will I?" Edward said, and found he did not entirely believe it, though he could not have said in that moment whether the doubt troubled him or came almost as a relief. The carriage pulled away down the same long gravel drive Eleanor's had traveled a year before, past the same iron gates, and Edward watched it go without moving from the steps, without any of the careful busyness he had used, a year ago, to avoid standing at a window and watching a woman leave. He simply watched this time, and let himself feel the full, uncomfortable weight of what it meant to be the one left standing in an empty drive twice, by 2 very different women, for reasons that were, in the end, not so very different at all. That evening, alone in the dining room built for 12, Edward sat at the head of the table and looked at the long stretch of empty chairs on either side of him. Grant brought his dinner in silence, set it down with the same careful attention he had always shown, and lingered a moment at the edge of the room, as though waiting to see whether his duke required anything more than food. "Grant," Edward said, before the older man could withdraw. "Your Grace, did you know about Margaret and Duke Fell?" Grant's expression did not change, though something in his posture suggested the question had been anticipated for some time. "It was not my place to say, Your Grace, without proof to offer." "But you suspected." "I suspected a great many things," Grant said carefully, "that were not mine to comment on." Edward nodded slowly, understanding, without needing it spelled out further, that his household had watched this second failure unfold with the same quiet, resigned patience they had shown the first, waiting for their duke to notice on his own what everyone beneath his roof had already understood. "Thank you, Grant," Edward said, "for everything this past year. I know it cannot have been easy managing a household through so much change." Something shifted in the old butler's face, a flicker of genuine feeling breaking briefly through 30 years of careful professional restraint. "The house has seen harder years, Your Grace. It generally survives them." "Does it?" Edward said quietly, looking around the dining room at portraits that no longer hung crooked because no one had bothered to move them since Margaret's departure, at curtains still the pale gold she had chosen, at a room that felt, despite every effort at renovation, exactly as empty as it had the night Alina left it. He ate his dinner alone in silence, and did not once find himself glancing toward the empty chair across the table, because he had, somewhere in the past year, stopped expecting anyone to fill it, and that admission, quiet and unspoken as it was, felt like the first honest thing he had allowed himself to feel in longer than he cared to count. Later, walking the grounds under a sky just beginning to darken, he found himself once again at the small garden behind the feed shed, where the young roses had opened their first blooms, that very weak, deep red against the fading light. He crouched beside them for a long while, saying nothing, thinking of very little beyond the simple, undramatic fact of their survival, and found that this, more than anything Margaret had said on her way out the door, was the thing that finally settled something unresolved in his chest. Thank you for watching, and comment for next part. Thank you.